It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Walls to Utah State University for the first of two seminars here for the Ecology Center. Dr. Walls received her undergraduate degree at the University of Kentucky and her PhD at the University of California at San Diego. She then began her nearly Santa Barbara, really? Okay. Okay, so she'll provide editorial comment on the remainder of this here. Okay, she then began her nearly continuous affiliation with Resources for the Future, where she is now a senior fellow. Resources for the Future, for those who do not know, is an independent Washington-based think tank whose goal is to generate economic research and policy solutions that lead to a healthy environment and a thriving economy. At RFF, Margaret publishes research papers, pursues grant and contract opportunities, gets to work with graduate students across the country, all without being obligated to teach any classes. So, Margaret's research interests are, to say the least, diverse. Her CV shows sustained interest in the management of solid waste and the value of open space in urban environments. She was among the first to explore the economic and environmental effects of the then futuristic notion of what was called telecommuting. Okay, we're there. Yeah, okay. A large body of her research has focused on the economic consequences of climate change-related increases in the risk of sea level rise, flooding, hurricanes, and other extreme weather outcome. She's long had an interest in designing efficient and equitable tax policies to pay for public goods, an interest she has applied over the years to federal and state public lands. More recently, she has measured the economic outcomes associated with large-scale national monuments, a topic that remains highly germane to those of us living here in Utah. And finally, Margaret has a strong interest in environmental justice, about which she's going to speak with us today. Did I get the rest of that?
Can you all hear me? Is it coming through? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I understand that's like, what?
I told you I was going to tell lies.
Did you?
Yeah, I did.
Just dug back in my career. So I'm happy to be the first person post-COVID. I guess I don't think we're post-COVID, but to come in person, right? So it's great that people came out, and that's super. I'm really excited to be here, and I've enjoyed everybody I've been talking with today. So I'm going to talk today about conservation and environmental justice. I actually just took this opportunity of giving this talk to construct this talk. So this is a topic that I've been having in my head for a while and have some things to say about. So I just put it all together in these slides. And what I'm going to tell you about is a lot of what's going on in the federal policy arena, and then the sort of intersection of these two topics. A bit about conservation funding, and then a little bit about some research that I started this summer with a grad student, actually, on the land and water conservation funds. It's some preliminary results, but just to show you a few numbers. So let's see if I can go forward. Does this maybe have an on off or anything? Wait a minute, maybe that did it. No?
And this is in the present mode. Right, so it's in there.
I mean, I'm happy to stand over here if that works, or take the mouse. Is it forwarding when you do that?
Yeah, I guess you could just advance with this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so yeah, this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Obviously, in this short talk, I'm not giving you the entire background, history, and scholarship of environmental justice, but I would like to introduce that to you a little bit, and some of you may already know a lot about that topic. Then what's going on these days in 2021, and then what's going on in conservation, especially with the 30 by 30 goal that's been established, and talk about the funding for conservation, which drives our conservation outcomes, and my own sense about why there's a mismatch between kind of EJ objectives and conservation. And then just, as I said, talk about the Land Water Conservation Fund and some concluding remarks. Okay, so just a quick history on environmental justice and some things you can read if you want to read more about this topic. So, this movement arose in the early 1980s, and it was really around the siting of noxious facilities, mainly hazardous waste facilities, some solid waste facilities in the South, a lot in the South, and African-American communities in the South. And I just would say, if these two things, I put pictures up over here, is the toxic waste and race was a report by the United Church of Christ, which was a guy named Ben Chavez, who'd been very active in the civil rights movement. And they had a commission on racial justice, and they did this report. And it actually was kind of researchy, but very advocacy oriented. And then Dumping in Dixie by Robert Bullard, whose name you may have heard of because he is really on the news a lot these days. And those were two kind of landmark studies. And I think what's interesting about the EJ movement really is that several things. One is it really did emphasize racial issues, not so much poverty and low income, but it was really a racial thing. And also that research and advocacy were sort of hand in hand. And I think that's really interesting going forward for us as researchers to be thinking about how to work with EJ communities. And that's something we could come back to at the end if you like. A really interesting quote. I love this book that I've highlighted at the bottom by Luke Cole and Sheila Foster, From the Ground Up. I really highly recommend that book. Is really good at giving you the whole breadth of things that drove the movement. And they say the EJ movement was a river fed by many tributaries. And I just wanted to put that quote up here because I really like it. And the tributaries are the civil rights movement, the anti-toxics movement, which I think is kind of like the Love Canal thing in the 60s, academic researchers, and they point out this fact that research was kind of going on hand in hand here, Native American movements, and then the labor movement they bring up too. So that there were a lot of things going on that kind of came together. Interestingly, the environmental movement is late to the EJ thing. I'll just say that. Environmentalists, of course, have led a lot of accomplishments in the environmental arena, led to the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and so forth. But it's really interesting the way Cole and Foster describe how environmentalists came at these problems not from a community-based, we have problems in the community sort of thing, but more from a legalistic standpoint. And I won't go into all those details here, but I think we've learned in recent years that there have been some few issues at a few environmental groups. Some things have kind of come up, and now they're a little bit more on board with the environmental justice aspect and helping disadvantaged communities. So I put a question mark by that because they're certainly part of this story, but not the main part. And I would say then quickly on the scholarship and research over the years, there's a lot of literature. And I think where it went from the 80s till now is really digging into the health effects of environmental issues in EJ communities and diagnosing those issues. And then a lot of discussion back and forth about what came first. Did the noxious facility come in, the property values fall, and then poor people moved in? And there was a healthy debate about that question. And there is some of that goes on. But I think the end result is, well, hang on a minute. There's a lot of segregation in housing markets and a lot of problems that lead people to live in certain places that don't just have to do with, well, it's a cheap piece of property. I don't have very much money. I'm going to live there. So that has been a healthy debate in the scholarship that I think is ongoing, but settled pretty well that there are problems in African-American, other minority and low-income communities that are not just market dynamics, if you will. These days, I would say that a lot of the EJ concerns are around you'll hear the term cumulative impacts a lot. And what that really means is there's a concern that we're not worrying about all the multiple things that are happening in these disadvantaged communities. And sometimes those are multiple pollutants. So you may have many pollutants that are below regulatory limits, but you have a whole bunch of them. And so there's a concern like we're missing some of the health effects there when we don't look at everything. But it also means there's underlying factors like flood risks and extreme heat. So very well documented that communities that are considered EJ communities or disadvantaged are high at risk for flooding. That's a problem that we see. And also that those communities have, a lot of them have underlying vulnerabilities, which might be related to just their socioeconomic status, underlying health problems, and things like that. And vulnerabilities are really part of the problem, right? They're part of the story about why there are issues. I like to point out this long-lived capital investments, pollutant legacy problems, because, and those pictures over there kind of illustrate it. So that's a highway that you've been to New Orleans. You know this highway if you've been to New Orleans. So that Claiborne Avenue is in the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans. So that's a picture from 1954 up above, which is a thriving community apparently. And then they built a freeway right smack through the middle of that neighborhood. And that's a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And my point is, it's there and it's kind of there to stay. It's very hard to get rid of something once you have it. And that's the nature of a lot of the problems in EJ communities, in my opinion, is the infrastructure that's there, the refinery that gets built and it's there for decades and decades, the highway that's there and is built for decades and decades. So there actually, I think has been mention of trying to get that. I think President Biden has something about getting that highway out. There are other examples, this is not a lone thing. There are other cities that have this problem. And then big deal these days is climate policy. So in the mitigation world, major concerns among EJ groups about cap and trade programs and related flexible policies that we economists really like, because what they do is allow pollution to move from place to place, right? Like you have a cap, but you allow one source to trade with the other source, and you might have the source that gets more is in the low income community. There's a lot of research on this that suggests maybe that's not going on, but in any case, it's a major concern. Also a major concern among EJ groups in the climate policy world is that we're going to invest in things that they don't want in their community, like CCUS and bioenergy, direct air capture, nuclear, things like that. So these are a big focus today, I think. And then another big focus, and some of the issues I work on are in the impacts and adaptation space, big pushback on the use of benefit cost analysis. And this is because, especially in the flooding world, the way decisions are made about investments in levees, the way decisions are made about investments in other kinds of infrastructure, the way decisions are made about disaster aid are based on avoided flood damages, which are higher in high valued properties. So they inherently in those programs benefit wealthier communities versus poor communities. So there's a lot of pushback on benefit. Another tool we love as economists. So, hey, we're getting beat up here. So I would just point these things out as some of the current issues that I think see at the top of the list. We're holding up a series of webinars that you can watch called Exposure, and we've had 4 of them and 2 more to come, and where we have a panel of experts, panel of researchers and people from EJ organizations talk about various issues. We've done one on benefit cost analysis. We've done one on climate adaptation and flooding. We did one on energy poverty and energy issues. And then we did a first one that was on an introduction to the topics. And so anyway, all the recordings are up if you'd like to watch. So in the president released Executive Order 14008 on the climate crisis in January, or I can't remember, very early on. And EJ figures prominently. So the word justice appears 31 times in that document. So I want to highlight a few things about it because it's really important. The Justice 40 initiative is a really key component of that. And it says that 40% of the benefits of certain federal investments must go to disadvantaged communities. There's going to be a new EJ screening tool to identify those disadvantaged communities. So EPA has a screening tool now called EJ Screen. You can go on the website and it'll identify communities spatially based on pollution levels, income, race, a bunch of other things. But I think there's a sense in which it's a little outdated. And so they're updating that. They're requiring agencies to make EJ a part of their missions, and they established the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is meeting and making recommendations. And that's some luminaries in the field of EJ who've been, like Robert Bullard, people like that who've been around for a while. And then the other major thing the president did is this thing on benefit cost analysis, modernizing regulatory review, where he says that benefit cost analysis now has to account for distributional impacts. I will say that from my interactions with federal government agencies, including a meeting I just attended today in the middle of the day, they're really, really on top of this. Like they're just scrambling to figure out how to do all the EJ things across their agencies, what that means, how they're going to change the way they do things, and a lot of interest in how we're going to change benefit cost analysis, because it's not really set up, as Paul knows, to do distributional stuff. So that's background going on. Now, let me say a bit more on the Justice 40. So 40% of the benefits and investments have to go to disadvantaged communities. That's a pretty big deal. And so what's going on with that is the WEJAC made recommendations in May 2021 for a bunch of different things that should be done. I won't go into all those. They also listed a bunch of projects that they said they think are beneficial and not beneficial. So a big no, as I said earlier, actually, to the CCUS, bioenergy, nuclear power, geoengineering, all that and even cap and trade, they listed no. Those are not things we think are beneficial. And they made some other recommendations. And then there was a White House report that had some interim guidance on this Justice 40 thing. And it listed the types of programs that should fall under this umbrella, and the types of federal investments, which would basically be anything, like if a government agency gives out grant money, if a government agency hires people to do work, that counts. So anything kind of counts. And then they directed agencies to report back, do tell us, how are you going to calculate benefits of these investments so that we make sure we're reaching the 40%. And then the last thing they did is they set up 21 pilot programs. So there are 21 programs that right now are setting up, how are we going to do our thing so that we're ensuring 40% of benefits of what we do goes to disadvantaged communities. So we'll see how that plays out. That's just started. So you all probably know more about this, which is the 30 by 30 directive. That's also in the climate executive order. And it establishes a goal to conserve 30% of US lands and waters by 2030. Also, there's a couple of other key parts: put a new generation of Americans to work, conserving our public lands and waters, and establish a civilian climate corps, which I don't think we're sure what that's going to be just yet. And again, as I'm sure you're familiar, this 30% goal is kind of there's been a global call for conserving a certain percentage of global lands and oceans for a few years now, to deal with species extinctions and also carbon, ecosystem carbon. So we're just kind of following on to that scientific literature. The 30%, I think people are debating about, but there's a few states that are actually proposing their own legislation to set their own 30% goals. So we did, some people have done this. I did with a colleague a little analysis of where we stand today in terms of achieving this goal. And we used what you're probably familiar with, the Protected Area Database of the US. And we used the top 2 categories of protective status, which is GAP status code 1 and 2 out of 4, which are the highest levels of protection. National parks fall in that category, wildlife refuges, national monuments, state parks, things that are permanently protected for nature. And by our calculations, about 14% of US lands, 320 million acres, are currently protected. Most of that is federal land. You probably know that. You live in Utah, so you've got a pretty good sense of that. But that map shows you that it varies a lot by state. So those colors are shaded for the percentages of lands that fall in those top 2 categories of protection. And, many, many states are below 5%, including the one I live in, Virginia. And then some are higher, and Alaska is very high. In response, one of the things that was required in that executive order was that the Secretary of the Interior collaborate with other agencies and then release a report for a strategy for how to achieve this. And I'll just point out a few things. I don't know how many people have looked at this, called America the Beautiful. It came out in June or June. It's a little vague, to say the least. It doesn't have a lot of specifics. So, but it emphasizes some things. I think there's some signals in there about what the federal government is thinking about how to get to this. And they emphasize that, well, whoa, we don't mean protection, we mean conservation. So in fact, I had a conversation with somebody I know was involved in writing this, who works in the White House, and saw that blog that we wrote and got on me for using gap status 1 and 2. And so we're not talking protection, we're talking conservation. So take that how you will, like, well, what do we really mean by conservation can really vary. But there are 8 principles laid out, and they're kind of high level: collaborative processes, benefit all people, locally led. We got to create jobs. Tribal sovereignty is important. We want voluntary stewardship on private lands, science-based and flexible approaches. I've obviously reduced these to short things, but this is what they're saying. And create an atlas. So my reading of it and knowing kind of what's a little behind the scenes is there's clear signals that federal lands are not going to be a focus. At least the White House isn't pushing that way. That private lands conservation and state and local efforts are highly emphasized, but we have no details on how we're going to do this. And my opinion is there was a bit of lip service to underserved communities. There was some stuff about that in there, and certainly the tribal sovereignty, but not a lot. Again, very short on details about what we're going to actually do to do this big conservation push. So this might be a bit of an overstatement, but to me, it's a little bit of a collision course in the way the Justice 40 initiative is moving the federal government's policy, like deliver 40% of benefits to disadvantaged communities is a pretty big deal. And really going to change, if they're taking it seriously, really change the way things are done. And yet, to me, that report on the 30 by 30 is all about, farmland. I don't know. I might be misreading it, but there's a lot of, private stewardship, private lands stuff. And to me, that doesn't sound completely in line with the objectives set out in environmental justice. So that's a little bit of my point here in this talk, and I'm going to say a little more about it. First, I want to tell you about some of the findings in the literature on this question about how are certain disadvantaged communities faring in terms of green space and parks and so forth. And I think there's a fairly consistent set of findings, and those are that this is several studies that have done things where they map, overlay maps of census statistics or EJ metrics of various sorts with tree cover, impervious surface, access to parks, proximity, various metrics that people will use. Each study will do something a little different. And they're all finding pretty consistent things that there's a negative correlation. So poorer communities have less tree cover, have more pavement, and poor households have less park access. And so I'm citing a few studies there. I find the Sims et al. Paper kind of interesting. She and her colleagues do a similar thing, but they take it a little step further. So this study is in New England, so it's regional. A lot of these studies might take a city at a time and look very closely at a neighborhood level. So they find that communities in the lowest income quartile or the highest share of people of color have 60% as much nearby protected land as those in the highest income or the whitest quartiles. And then the other point I think is interesting is that they point out that the conventional prioritization tools that we use for identifying what lands we want to protect are not set up to address these inequities. And I totally believe that. If you see the way I'm familiar with the way a few states do it, states that have conservation programs or easement programs, and they'll have tools to identify what are our lands we're really targeting. None of them, they're starting to change this, but most of them have not dealt with that inequity issue at all or looked at where people are. It's more about characteristics of the land, where it's located, if it's farmland, a lot of farmland protection programs, so it'd be like the quality of the farmland and so forth. And then the other set of studies in this space have really, some new literature is looking at the long-lasting effects of redlining. Are you familiar with redlining? So it's redlining was a practice introduced in the 1930s that the federal government, Federal Housing Administration, went into cities and to protect supposedly to protect loans from going into default that the federal government was responsible for. They outlined areas that were higher and lower risk, and they were green if they were low risk communities where we want to make loans there. Blue is the next level, and red were African-American communities that were not given loans. So basically it was a highly discriminatory housing practice that was in practice for decades. And it's led to many, many outcomes in our cities. In fact, I like the quote in the On Orlando and Ronansky paper, which says it cemented the built environment in many cities. So there are now a set of papers that look at these outcomes in terms of parks and green space and so forth. And they find, because digitized maps are available now. The University of Richmond, actually, some researchers there did it, and they can go access these and do your studies on them. And they have found now that a lot of those historical neighborhoods that are the result of discrimination are the ones that are suffering in this way. So those are some interesting studies. It just shows you the long-lasting effects of certain policies. So my point I really want to talk about now from here on out is how we fund conservation, because you know, that's dictating a lot of where things stand. I mean, redlining aside, okay, we still, when we invest in conservation, it takes money. Where are we putting that money? And are dollars flowing disproportionately to wider communities? And if so, why? And I just think this is not a question that I see answered in the literature. And by my tally, roughly, we're spending about $9 billion a year at the federal level for what I would call conservation, like really doing something, protecting lands in one way or another, and about $2 billion in state spending. Take those numbers with a little grain of salt. I did some work in this space many years ago, and I tried to update the numbers, and these are roughly in the ballpark. So the question is, where does this money go? Let me just point this out first, and this is also maybe a little out of date, but just to point out that the number of programs in the federal government that actually do conservation spending has really grown. We have a whole mess of programs in the federal government across agencies that spend money on some kind of conservation. Back in the day, they were really recreation focused. I mean, even if you think back to when we set up the hunting and fishing program conservation, the wildlife conservation programs, those were based on really recreation. They were hunting and fishing. They were for game species. And then the Land and Water Conservation Fund was 1965, and that was all about recreation. But in the 90s and 2000s, it's really been a lot of more conservation, where it's for ecosystem services, you know, water quality, wetlands protection, and things like that. And again, a lot of easement programs on private land. This is well, that's a giant pie chart, sorry. So this is the $9 billion, how the $9 billion is broken down by agency. 2/3 of it goes to the US Department of Agriculture. That is spending almost entirely on private farmland. So that map there is Conservation Reserve Program, which is the biggest chunk of that money, which is a program that's farmers voluntarily enter to set aside some of their land out of cropland production for protection of like a river buffer or something like that. And it's for a 15-year period. And that's a map of where those lands are. They're mainly in the heartland. That's not an issue. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just pointing out that these aren't, you know, programs for recreation or accessibility to people to do stuff on them. Not saying I don't have benefits. So the point here to me is that the opportunities in the programs that we currently have for serving disadvantaged communities are extremely limited. They have a heavy rural emphasis, which rural is still an EJ. There are many EJ issues in rural communities, but you know, these are a lot of programs on farmlands, private forests, wetlands, focused on species. There's a lack, as I just said, of public access. State programs are very similar. Not all states have conservation funding programs, but many do, where they take a dedicated funding source and spend it on some kind of conservation. They also have, to varying degrees, an emphasis on easements on private land. you know, one last point about this on how these existing programs are limited. So I, just out of curiosity, went on the USDA website, looked at something on the Conservation Reserve Program, and sure enough, there's something about EJ on there, about taking the program and doing what they can to help farmers, you know, minority farmers. I can't remember, I read it quickly, but there's some language there. But my point is that there are limits in what they can do, right? Like the program has to do what it's got to do. It's set up to conserve on 15-year contracts lands on farmland. So that's the limits. They're not going into Detroit and putting a park in there. That's not what they can do. So I think all of these federal agencies are now really focused on EJ issues, but they can only do certain things. They have limits based on their institutional restrictions. And okay, so this summer we looked at the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I'm going old school here because it's been around for a while and it really is recreation focused, parks and recreation. So if you're not familiar with LWCF, it was created in 1965. It has a federal land acquisition part and a state grant part. So land money goes to federal agencies for new parkland. They buy a lot of inholdings and things like that. And then money goes out to the states, and then the states spend it on parks and recreation. And the restrictions are, it has to be permanently protected parkland. So if you have an LWCF funded park, it has to stay a park forever. It's a matching grant, state grant program. So the state has to come up with money of its own too. 98% of counties in the US have a park that's been funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The money, let me see, this might be on my next slide. Yeah. Okay, so $900 million a year goes into the fund, and it comes from offshore oil and gas leases. So we were talking about this earlier today about this tension here. We're relying on fossil fuel revenues to fund our land conservation programs, but be that as it may, that's where the money comes from. Until 2020, the money bounced around every year because it isn't really a fund in the sense that, like, if you're familiar with the hunting and fishing, the way the hunting and fishing tax revenue works, that's outside of congressional appropriations. That money goes into funds and it goes directly to the states, and the states match it with their license revenue and spend it on wildlife conservation. Congress has nothing to do with it, and that money's been very consistent over the years as gun sales continue. Not LWCF, Congress has to appropriate that money, so it's bounced around until last year when they passed the Great American Outdoors Act, and now it will be $900 million a year because it will not go through Congress. So that's actually was a very big move. And in 2019, the John D. Dingell Conservation Act guaranteed that at least 40% will go to the states, and so only 60 can go to the federal side. And that's also a big deal because the states have kind of lost out in recent years. If you can see, notice in that bar graph, and that graph is inflation adjusted. So you can see that in the 70s, in 2019 dollars, there was a lot of money going in this program, but then it dwindled over time. So the last number on there is 2021, and that's at the 900 level, and that's where it should stay going forward. So it's quite an opportunity for states. So I did some preliminary analysis of this program in the summer with a graduate student. And we had data on all the grants that have been made back to 1965. And we don't know the exact location of each individual grant, so each project, but we don't know the geolocation of the project. We know the county. So I'll come back to that point. And we match that with socio-demographic data of various sorts. And then this is what we've done so far. Feedback is welcome. We took the spending that had gone over the years, and we divided it into quartiles from highest to lowest. So the top 25%, middle 2, and then the lowest. And then we calculated the socio-demographics of each of those quartiles. So we looked at the top spending quartile, what's the percentage white, percentage non-white, what's the poverty rate, what's the median income, and so forth. So we could compare like top and bottom quartiles, let's say. So let me show you some of those results. Okay, here's the first one. So those are the 4 quartiles of spending. So the number 1 is the lowest, and the bars are showing the percent of the non-white population in those quartiles. And this is across the whole country. I'll show you a map in a minute with the different states. So essentially, the counties that receive the most grants and the most dollars per capita, because counties are different sizes, we made it per capita, have fewer people of color, because that lowest graph has the highest non-white population compared to, like, look at the highest. So about a 6 to 11 percentage point difference between the highest and lowest quartiles. So where the most of the money's going, it's more white. This is the same thing, but on looking at rural areas. So county, we have for each county, what percentage of the county's population is living in rural areas. So counties that receive the most grants and the most dollars, over there in the bar 4, have the highest percent rural population. So this money's going to more rural counties that have more people living in rural areas. Kind of an interesting finding to me. We'll come back to that too. We didn't find any difference nationally in these quartiles between the people living below the poverty line or median income. So that's kind of interesting. However, when you look at how much more goes to rural areas, a lot fewer people benefit from LWCF grants below the poverty line than above. So when you kind of combine those two, there's a difference. So we looked at a couple of other things. There are 2 different kinds of LWCF grants that go out to the states. One is for land acquisition, one's for park development. So you're building something like a playground. And we didn't see any differences there. They look the same as the numbers in aggregate. We do see that things have gotten there's been a more disparate outcome over time. So back in the 70s, things were more equal in terms of those 4 the quartiles, in terms of percent people of color and rural. And the disparities have been growing. Okay, so busy map. So let me just point out what the finding is here. So this is the same thing, white, non-white, but now doing it by state. Because the way the program works is the money goes to the states by formula. Essentially, there's a little bit of wiggle room, but it's based on population and a little bit of need based on how much park you have. So if you have a lot of public lands, if you're in the West, you probably get a little bit less, but it's a formula. But once it gets to the states can do what they want with it. So where they put the money depends on their rules. All that's required is that they have a state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. And if they have a plan, then they'll be awarded the money, and then they spend, and the plan doesn't say, those of you who are in the recreation area may have looked at these. They don't get specific about, like, we're going to put a park in this location versus this. They're very high level plans. But then the states do what they want. So what does this find? The orange and yellow and browns tell you that there are fewer people of color in the top spending quartile than in the bottom spending quartile. So that's some of the southern states and a few others. The purples or light purples or white, I guess is about the same, is the same or more people of color in the top spending quartile than in the bottom. I have the same graph for poverty rates. So when we look nationally at the poverty rates, there wasn't much difference. But when we do it by state, there are some differences. So again, the orange and yellows and browns, fewer people in poverty in the top spending quartile. So the money is going to richer areas in those brown and gold and yellows. And the purples is more people in poverty in the top spending quartile. That means the money's tended to go to the poorer communities. So some thoughts about these findings. So first of all, I would just very quickly, of course, point out that counties' sociodemographics can vary a lot within the county. So maybe the county's getting the money, maybe it's a on average, higher level in, a higher county than some other counties in the state. But within that county, there's a lot of variation, and there might be a poor neighborhood that gets a park. We're not picking that up because we don't have the precise location. But nonetheless, the way these programs work is the state gets the money and they dole it out to the counties, and the counties spend, the counties do the job in most places of putting the park in. So I guess I'm of two minds here. Like in some ways it's a limited analysis, but in other ways, there's telling you something, because this is the way the program works. The states get the money and give it out to the counties pretty much. So I think we're learning something, but it would be nice to do a second level and look at the geolocated data, which, by the way, wasn't available until this year, and the Trust for Public Lands has digitized and made it available. And so we're working on them to give us the data, but they haven't done it yet because they said it was kind of beta mode for a while, and they're still working out some kinks. But it's available. You can find it. You can go to the website, and if you Google Trust for Public Lands, Land and Water Conservation Fund, you will probably get to the map that shows you all the different sites. So to me, like, I'm a big fan of this program, to be honest, and it feels like it should be the most equitable in terms of where it's putting its money. Yet my point again is states have a lot of discretion in what they do with this money once they get it. And communities have to have matching funds, or somebody has to come up with the matching funds. And that's a pretty big deal if you're a poor community to come up with enough money to match. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I'm on my last slide. I haven't paid any attention to time. So let me just conclude with a few thoughts on this topic. And one is that I think environmental justice is finally getting its due. Maybe we're finally giving it serious attention. And the Justice 40 initiative is really going to prompt a major shift in thinking on these issues. It's because it's forcing the hand of the federal government, and that's filtering through to states as well. The New York Climate Plan, the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA, has a 40% goal in it as well. So that plan is to reduce carbon emissions in the state of New York, and to do so in such a way that 40% of the benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. So there are other states will follow on to this a little bit, I think. And also the federal government, they have wield a big stick, so they can make some things happen. But a lot of that work might happen outside of conservation. And for me, it seems like in the conservation arena, and by conservation, I mean recreation, conservation, parks, there are some institutional hurdles. So one, as I pointed out, many federal and state programs that have dollars to spend are structured in ways that limit their applicability to EJ communities, farmland protection and so forth. Not saying they don't do good things, but if we would try to achieve a 40% goal for disadvantaged communities, we might going to be struggling with our existing programs. This matching grant poses a financial challenge for poor communities. We see that play out across a range of things, not just in the conservation world. Many programs have what I would call paperwork challenges, bureaucracy that are really difficult for a community to kind of do what they need to do to get the money. This is well known in the FEMA world, for example. FEMA has a lot of layers of paperwork required for various things, disaster assistance, even for individuals, it's tough to get that money. You read a lot of stories about that, but also for communities to get money. And they're building resilient infrastructure and communities program, which would have some conservation parts in it, because you can spend that money for, wetlands protection and so forth, anything that has a resiliency benefit. That program's going to have a ton of money. The last I saw in the budget is going to have $1 billion a year. It's a very big grant program. It hasn't been quite this big, but it's getting bigger. And a lot of conservation activities could happen in that program. Anyway, it's a heavy lift to get one of those grants, and poor communities are going to struggle with those sorts of things, just as fact. They don't have the community government infrastructure sometimes to do it, the manpower to do it. And the last point is, again, back to the LWCF, but also broader, which is when states have discretion in spending the federal money, anything can happen. So let me just close with an anecdote on that, which I think I just told somebody else. So sorry if I'm repeating myself, but on one of our EJ webinars that we had a panel on flooding and resiliency. And a woman named Earthia Nance, who's at Texas Southern University and is quite an expert in this area. She's an engineer by training. She's a PhD engineer. She's in a planning department, but she's also worked in local government and knows a lot about what's going on with federal spending on flood infrastructure and so forth. And she's in Houston now. That's where Texas Southern is, and very involved. Since Hurricane Harvey in Houston, they've really taken a lot of things seriously about what they're doing about their infrastructure and their flooding, trying to improve their stormwater infrastructure, do a lot of things so that they're prepared for the next event, which will happen. And she has I encourage you to listen to that webinar, because she tells the story about how they passed a local referendum to spend money. They raised a certain amount of money locally. This is all local money. And they passed a referendum to give a certain percentage of that money in disadvantaged communities. Like, they put it in the law that they passed. But she points out that what has happened, and she can tell the story, it's been written up in the news, is there was so much discretion locally on how things could actually work that at the end of the day, that didn't happen. And so one of the points she emphasizes a lot, and I've heard her say this before, is as long as there's discretion at the state level, perhaps, or at the local level, you don't know, like, you do your best in setting things up, maybe with this Justice 40 initiative, but as soon as there's local discretion, you don't know what'll happen. So you have to kind of, I guess, stay honest, stay on it, say, diligent. We'll see where this goes, but that's going to be part of the problem, I think, in the conservation arena as well, is discretion can be a good thing, but it can also backfire in terms of some of your other objectives. And that is a park in Washington, D.C. that I look out my office window and see every day. That is, and I've just decided to put that up here as the last picture, because that is the most heavily used little piece of green infrastructure I've ever seen. There's people out there recreating like all the time. And so I thought I'd put that up here as the last little slide. Thank you so much.
Perfect timing.
Is it? Okay. I'll leave time for questions or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes for questions. I'll just